Welcome to Unschooling Conversations. Today I'm joined by Rachel Evans. She's my very good friend and she blogs at Connect and Respect, but she's going to introduce herself in a little minute. In this episode, we are going to talk about how children learn without a curriculum or without an enforced style of learning. We're going to talk about natural learning, and we're going to answer lots of questions that I get asked fairly regularly about how children learn when they're being unschooled. I'm Heidi Steel. I'm a former teacher and an unschooling parent to 4 school-aged children who are happy living and learning as they go. I've been unschooling my children for almost 10 years. I blog regularly and organise coaching courses and mentoring services on unschooling, which you can find out more about at liveplaylearn.org, and you can also find me on Facebook. I'm joined today by Rachel. We are going to be talking about natural learning. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you for having me on to talk again. I am Rachel Evans. I have got 2 school-aged boys. One is 9 and one is 13. My eldest boy went to school for 3 years. It was a really negative experience for the whole family. And so after he completed 3 years, we removed him to home educate, and honestly never looked back. And my youngest boy has never been to school. And since they have been home educated, I did dabble with I quite like structure and I quite like routine, and I thought, oh, we could do semi-structured and that would work really well for me, except that it didn't really work well particularly for my eldest one at first. So I had to really delve into, in fact, he said to me, this works for you, it doesn't work for me. And so I had heard of unschooling, and I thought, well, I have really got to get out of my comfort zone now and start to find out more about this. And once I'd really understood what it was about and how it could work for us and how it would completely meet the needs of both of my children, I have been a staunch advocate of unschooling ever since.
Fabulous. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to paint a little picture of what my children are doing at the moment, because it really is one of the things listeners really like to hear about, like, what's going on in our households, and then I'll probably ask you to do the same. But I was thinking about this earlier just before we logged on, because I was trying to gather myself and bits, and my younger 2, my 10-year-old and my 7-year-old, were upstairs in my bedroom, and they had emptied the laundry baskets out, and they had tipped them upside down, and they were underneath them, and they were swimming around on the floor pretending to be turtles, sea turtles, and they were having such a lovely time. It was so lovely. So that's what they were doing this evening. My older 2 are gaming, and that's pretty standard. There are lots of other things that are going on as well, but just as a snapshot at that moment, like what's going on in the house now, my older 2 are gaming, and they quite frequently game together, not always, but frequently they game together, and they've got a nice little group of online friends, which really developed and grew and solidified during lockdown. That was one of the gifts surprising gifts that lockdown gave us, actually. Anyway, so that's what they're doing. That's like a little snapshot of what's going on in my house this evening. So what kind of things are going on in your boys' lives at the moment?
Well, I can right this minute, I can tell you my younger one is gaming. I can hear him in the background, and in fact he's probably multitasking, so because he's a 2-screen kind of guy, so he is playing a game on the laptop, but he's almost certainly got one of his Pokemon YouTubers on as well, because he is, well, we would call it researching. He calls it just watching videos. But effectively, he is researching about Pokemon. He's very much a cyclical interest child. And we've massively come back to Pokemon recently. And just today, he received the brand new Legends Arceus. He calls it Arceus, it's Arceus, but we have a standing joke that it's called Arceus, but it's not. So he's busy gathering all the information that he wants to from his favorite Pokemon YouTubers, so that he knows how to best play the game that he's just got. My older one, I would suspect, though I don't know because I haven't been to see what he's up to, but normally this time of day he would be reading manga. So he has several series that he follows, and his evenings are quite often spent catching up with the latest episodes, and he likes to schedule them into his day, and this time of day is often when he's catching up with that. So that's what he'll be doing right now.
Brilliant. I love that you've brought up double screening, but yeah, something that happens a lot in this house, doing something on a PC or a laptop, and then having something, normally YouTube, playing on another device, or if you're, or like split screening. That's something that happens.
Yeah, my elder one doesn't tend to do it as much. In fact, no, he rarely does it, in fact, although he will often put music on in the background, particularly if he's reading. He has now found music that he feels complements and adds to the reading that he's doing. So he will often play music in the background and be reading on because a lot of his manga subscriptions are digital. So he will often be reading and listening at the same time. But my younger one particularly will be doing two completely different things. One, something on the iPad, usually YouTube, and often videos that he has seen before. So whereas my older one will almost never watch the same video twice, my younger one learns very differently, and he likes to hear the same things over and over and over again. And then it gets to a point where he can quote huge chunks of script at you from these, the ones that he watches. So he usually has, as you say, YouTube on one, or usually a familiar set of videos going around, and then he's gaming on his laptop in the other screen. That's very common for him. And he almost invariably has. He uses the iPad and YouTube videos like we would use radio.
Yeah, you did something really interesting when you were talking about your son watching YouTube, and you put it in terms of him researching, which is something that you do really, really well. So I will talk about a lot of the time about doing things that our children enjoy, or following their interests, or just allowing them to choose how they spend their time, and doing things that they love. And what you've done is picked out something that our children do that they love doing, or that comes really easy to them, that we might sometimes look at and go, hang on a minute, now they're on two screens. Or one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what are our children doing when they're watching YouTubers game? Why are they spending their time watching somebody else play a game that they really like, and not really being able to see what our children are doing? And so you put it in like almost like an educational term,
right? Yeah.
Which is, he's doing research, and he doesn't see it as research. He doesn't go, I'm going to go and research today. He just goes, I want to go and watch this person play this game that I really like. But it brings us nicely round to, what does learning look like, and what does learning look like? What does it look like for your children in your house? One of the ways it looks is watching YouTubers play their favorite game. Are there any other examples of things you can think of that what learning looks like? You can now support the podcast on Ko-fi. That's Ko-fi, where you can contribute via a one-off collection of £5, or by subscribing monthly. Monthly subscribers receive pre-releases on blog posts, previews, for the podcasts and free access to monthly webinars and more, as a thank you for your ongoing support. So if you are a regular listener, I would like to invite you to contribute via kofi.com/live, play, learn. Of course, if that's not within your capabilities right now, I continue to welcome you here just as you are. And thank you for listening and taking time to consider unschooling in your family. And now back to our unschooling conversation.
Well, I think one of the things I think you maybe just think about just now is kind of what I'm starting to think is the difference between conscious and unconscious learning. So I very much class, watching the gamers playing the games, the favorite games they play, it starts as what I think is they just enjoy watching it. And certainly for my younger one, it's a way of desensitizing into a new thing. So he can watch somebody playing something, and then the anxiety about trying something new has been reduced because he has an expectation of what it's going to look like. So whilst he doesn't see it as I'm desensitizing myself and getting new ideas, I can see that's what's happening. And this is an unconscious thing for him. He's not consciously planning this. It is an unconscious process. And I would say also this idea of research is up to now been unconscious, but now I'm starting to see where he'll say, oh, I need to find out about that. I know that's in this video. I'm going to go and check that out. And Mum, could you write this down for me so that I have got it? So I start to see that as in consciously starting to refer to the materials that he's just been watching for fun, but he knows where they are, and he's consciously picking out the information that he needs so that he can use that when he goes and plays. So that's really, it's a current shift that's just happening with him, and it's really, really interesting. But I would say in terms of what my children are doing in terms of their learning, they watch and they game. My elder one is hugely fascinated by Japan, and it came from starting with anime, and then it moved on to manga. Manga covers just the most enormous range of topics, from completely bizarre and out of this world to ancient Chinese military warfare, to basketball, to football, to Vikings. And again, I don't think he sees this as learning. He just sees it as an interesting manga. But all the while, that unconscious learning about the Vikings and the ancient Chinese military warfare, he will come and tell me all about various leaders, and he's really interested in the strategy. He'll come and say to you, oh, it's amazing the strategy and tactics these leaders have used in this manga, in this war that they're having in this manga, and that has then led him to want to seek out other things with similar themes. So it's always driven by interest and passion. Off the back of that, he's found young men podcasters who live in Japan. I think one of them is originally Australian, one of them is a Brit, and they started talking, podcasting about the manga and the anime. And of course, over time, it has extended into different facets of Japanese life and Japanese culture. And so off the back of that, his appreciation of, his understanding and his learning about Japanese culture has expanded to the point where he has taken up karate. and it's following these passions and allowing that to continually grow. You tend to think, oh, they're just watching YouTube, or they're just doing this. And if you don't get involved, and I think this is the beautiful thing about unschooling, is it's very, people tend to think it's about, oh, you let them do what they want, and and you just don't pay any attention, and you leave them in a corner and somehow it will all happen. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, we allow them to follow their passions, but we also become interested and passionate and about their interests, so we can see when they are, you know, watching various things, we can see what's happening, and also we can then know what to. So he started, I say to me, oh, well, but martial arts, and I'm like, well, actually, funnily enough, there is a local group for home educated children that is martial arts. Would you like to try it? And of course, the first response I get is no, because of the way that, you know, my challenges my children have. But you know, I know that it is something that he would like, and I know him very well. So over a period of time, gradually desensitizing this and having these conversations about this, he actually agreed to start the martial arts. And then from that, we decided that particular martial arts wasn't working for us. So we found a much more formalized karate, which was not something that I would have ever expected him to do. And he's absolutely loving it. And from that came an interest in fitness and personal fitness. And now he's got a personal fitness trainer that he is. So but this has all come from the back of watching hours and hours and hours of anime. And if I had decided at that point to limit that because it wasn't worthwhile, educational, valuable, we would have lost all the learning that's driven from the interest and the usefulness and the relevancy and everything else that's come off the back of it. But because when we unschool, we become partners in our children's learning, and we become invested in. I mean, I've learned so much about Japan and so much about manga and anime. And in fact, when we went to Waterstones recently, and they didn't have a price on the back of this particular book from the manga section, and I said to her, the shop assistant, could you possibly give me a price check on this? And she said, oh, well, not all of the manga is printed in this country, so we don't have English prices. And what I decided not to tell her was actually it wasn't a manga, it was a manhwa, because it was Korean. But I only know that because I have been invested and interested in the passions of my children, because as unschoolers, that's what we do. It's not about sticking them in a room and letting them get on with it. We do become very involved with our children's passions, and because we are involved, we trust that they won't stay doing this. It might sometimes feel like they're doing the same thing forever, but actually, when you step back and look at it, you can see the changes over time as to where they're going. And therefore, you can facilitate all the various conversations and next steps and offer them.
Fantastic. I think you've answered all those questions that I have listed down that I said we were going to look at. I'm going to pick them out. I'm going to draw them out so that we can really be explicit about them. So I'm going to draw a few things out. That was brilliant. So one of the things that people quite often ask me is how will our children learn new things? Like if they only had, actually this question comes in two parts, because one of the questions is, what if my child only has one interest and just focuses on that thing? How will they learn new things and broaden out? And then the flip side of that is, what if my child doesn't have one interest and they just flip around lots and lots of different little things, and they don't invest their time in learning something, I'm going to use the word properly, like learning something in depth. And so how will they learn new things? And you've brilliantly drawn out a picture for us there about how one thing can actually lead to a multitude of other areas of interest, other topics completely, things that we might divide up into different areas in terms of, you've got like a physical aspect there, karate and getting a physical trainer, there's reading, there's gaming, there's knowledge, geography, if you're looking at Japan, there's history. My camera's going wonky. So you've beautifully drawn that out there. But one of the things that we don't get to do when we're not using the curriculum is we don't get to foresee that. We don't get to say, here's the curriculum, you're going to learn this day, this the next day, or this week, or that next week, and it's all packaged out beautifully for us. And I think that's one of the things that we can maybe find tricky, because we can't see how it's going to unfold, and we can't see how that's going to work out. And what one person's learning journey, they might start with manga, So for example, my son really likes manga as well, but he's not interested in karate. That's not part of his learning journey. That's not where it has taken him. He is exploring a completely different area, or it's all he has made completely different connections that have then led to other different connections. So his learning journey looks completely different to your son's, even though sort of their starting point, their main interest is the same. But it's this unfolding and this trusting that our children will move on. They will stay curious. They will keep asking questions. They will keep engaging with the things that interest them. And one of the things, or one of the reasons that they continue to do that, and one of the reasons that they do that, is because of our involvement and our facilitation, and us saying yes. That idea that, when they say, can I do this? Yes, you can. Can we look at this? Yes, you can. Can we go here? Can we research this? What is there out there? Oh, I'm really interested in karate. Right, well, I've got access to a knowledge base in the wider home ed community, and I can find out where there's karate classes and offer them. And that involvement and that support and facilitating what they're doing is what then enables them to stay curious. Because as soon as you start saying no, sort of arbitrarily saying no because, I don't know, because you can't be bothered, or because you're not interested, or
because you feel that you can't see where it's going and it's a waste of time.
Or it's a waste of time. So you're overlaying that onto it. As soon as you start doing that, that's when you start shutting them down, and those questions that they're asking, they start stopping. They don't stop stopping. They stop asking them because they haven't been validated, and they haven't been seen as important, and they haven't been supported. Our children haven't been supported.
My best example of that was my son went through a phase of asking for lots of different video games, and I was like, constantly spending all this money on games that he dibbles and dabbles and then goes off again. And I remember at one particular occasion he asked me for Civilization, and I didn't really know anything about it. And I was on the verge of saying, no, that's enough. I've bought you loads and loads of games that you've not really settled into. But I didn't. I had a quick look at what it was and decided it was appropriate. It wasn't anything out, it was completely not appropriate for him. And I said yes. And off the back of that has been the most incredible learning web. And I think this is how unschooling is very different to school learning. School learning is very linear and siloed and subject compartmentalized, whereas I see natural learning and unschooling allowing a web of learning. And Civilization led to the most extraordinary explosion in a web of learning. He suddenly, having played the game, he was suddenly very interested not only in the strategy and the tactics and all the numeracy that's involved in that game and all the reading that's involved in the game, but also he became aware of religions and politics and various scientific discoveries and landmarks and geography and political figures and historical figures. And it was an absolute explosion of knowledge that came up. And then he wanted to download different packs where you could use as true start locations rather than random start locations on this random map. So he was able to download the real world and to actually start the campaigns with London and Britain, where Britain was and everywhere. And suddenly he knew where all the countries in the world was, his geography knowledge and his capital city knowledge. And as I went through his room one day, I saw him reading a whole thing about the various queens of England because he wanted to understand what their characters were so that he could utilize that to best effect in the game. Now, if I'd said, right, today we're going to play Civilization and we're going to look at, Queen Victoria, it simply wouldn't have happened. But because it was passionate, because he was interested in Civilization, all of that came off the back of me saying yes to him playing Civilization and being comfortable with the idea that it might not last very long But actually, it was the one thing that really impressed on me, the importance of saying yes.
Fabulous. We both obviously have gamers in our house.
Yeah,
and a lot of what our children, well, not so much my younger two, although they do game, but not with the same intensity. And the interesting thing about having 4 children is that I can see that they all have access to the same things, and they all use them completely differently. But one of the stories I have is about my second son, and he must have been 8 or 9. He must have been about 8 or 9, and he was really, really into playing Fortnite. That was a really big thing for quite a long time. And like you say, like, you just look at some things and you think, what where is this going? What is this? What are they learning? But just trusting that process. Just sometimes leaning into the fact that he was really enjoying it, and he was, like, to all intents and purposes, he was improving in his skill in the game. So I could see through observation that there was something, he was acquiring something from that. But we went to a museum, and I can't remember which museum it was, but they had like a little a setup of a battle, and they had this hill, and they had the little cannons and the little army here and the army up there, and they had it all laid out. And my eldest, I can remember him saying, like, who won this? What's going on? Like, really, like, trying to work out who these people were and what they were doing. And there I was trying to read really rapidly all the information about this battle and what was going on and who was going to win and how it was worked out. But my second son took one look at it and he went, well, clearly that army over there is going to win because they've put these people over here and they're going to. But it was all relatable to, like, Fortnite. Like, he had it all sussed out, like, how this battle played out just from this model, because of all his experience playing Fortnite. And there I was trying to rapidly read it, and then I was like, oh yes, you're right, what he said, like what he said, because of all this time that he had put into playing Fortnite. I also took him to the Imperial War Museum, which was fascinating. It was just me and him, and it was absolutely fascinating. But he knew the names of, like, all of the weapons, and he could tell me what their range, like, he had all the stats, what their range was and what they fired, and how powerful they were. And it was, I think, to standers by, it was probably a little bit disconcerting, actually. But he had acquired all this, like, statistical knowledge.
But even the skills they get, because we've had my younger one has gone definitely through several phases of being quite focused into Fortnite, and having sat and watched and listened to an awful lot of play, it is, when you start to really look at it, it's so rich in learning. Particularly, what I noticed, that at one point he was playing in a group, and the ability for them to organize each other and to work together and to make decisions about the group and who was going to rescue and revive who, and so on and so forth. All of those skills, those communication skills, those organization skills, that the team working, which is so important, was actually being developed through a game that they simply saw as fun. When you look at, like, evaluation, my son can evaluate which weapons are best for which strategies and in which particular situation he's going to use it in. Whilst it's in the context of Fortnite and the weapons they're going to use, the skill of evaluating and matching the correct items to the correct situation is a life skill. It's about perseverance and those split-second decisions, and all of these things are embedded in these games that, unless you sit and really engage with your children in the games that they're playing, if you didn't do that, you'd only see it, they're just shooting each other, I don't see what they see in that. It's when you get involved with your children and you can see and how they are moving in a terrain, to best, to avoid being detected, or to plan how they're going to get from A to B. All of these skills are embedded in a game that they're playing purely because it's fun.
And one of the things they do is, I mean, I think we're both quite excited about this, really. One of the things my guys do, particularly now they've got a core group of friends that they play with regularly, and even when they bring in other people, when they do something like Fortnite or other team games, they all know each other's skills. They all know, so they will say to each other, you're really good at building, can you go and build a tower over there? And someone else say, well, you're really good at, like, you know, sneaking or whatever it is, you know, not sneaking, that might be the wrong word, stealthing, that's what they call it, isn't it? Stealthing, being stealthy. You go and you know, go and you know, spy on that group or infiltrate that and steal what we need. Or they all know each other's skills. And then when they come to doing things like you know, finding loot, they don't just keep it for themselves. They go, oh, actually I've found this, and actually you're really good at picking locks, and I've got this item, you have that. And someone else say, oh, you're really
this is your favorite weapon and you do really well with that, so I'll give you this, and do you have any of this? All of that sharing and you say utilizing the best resources to the best character,
and understanding each other really well as well, and building those really you know, that's like deep friendship stuff, isn't it? I know you well enough to know that if I need help with this, I mean, you know, talking about transferring those skills into the real life, I know you well enough that I know if I need help with this, you're the person I can ask, and you will give me really good advice or be able to help me, you know, build that house, or, you know, find a car, or, you know, write an essay, you know, whatever it is. It's those being able to transfer those skills into real life, which leads me on to how a lot of the things that we're talking about, a lot of the things that our children are interested in. So, you know, my girls are playing at sea turtles with baskets, and gaming, and, you know, manga. And my daughter's really into art. I've got my 7-year-old is absolutely delving deep into her Barbie world, and that has been going on for like 2 years now. These are all things that you will not find on a UK school curriculum. You know, there is no manga, or even if there is a manga study, it's only going to be a term of manga study. You know, there isn't a course on, you know, Fortnite gameplay, that you're not gonna be able to spend 2 years delving deep into your passion of playing with Barbies. And even my daughter, who likes art, outside of school, that looks completely different, which I could go into how that looks completely different, but it's not a set curriculum. She learns about different artists when she picks up a book about an artist and she wants to find out more. You know, she, you know, logs onto YouTube and she might follow a tutorial every now and then, or she might just do her own thing. She spent 6 months last year drawing eyes, you know, as in an eye, the physical eye, not the letter I. You know, different styles, different shapes, different sizes, different animals, and exploring that. It wasn't a curriculum based, it wasn't set out in the curriculum. So even though it sounds like a schooly subject, the way that she explores it isn't schooly. Anyway, the question really is, if our children are learning all these things that aren't being taught in school, how are they going to learn everything they need to know? How is, you know, because they're not doing the school subjects that are being taught there. So how are our children going to know all the things that they are going to need to know?
Well, I just think it's funny. I've talked about this before in some of my my other talks and blogs and things that I've done. For me, it's an interesting question, because there's two questions here. Is some people ask me, how are they going to learn all the things that they need to know? And they mean one of two things. One is so that they can pass exams, or they can live their lives. And these are two very different questions. And the thing I would say, what I have noticed with all the reading and all the observation I've done, both of myself and my learning, because I've become much more conscious of how I learn and why I learn and why I'm interested in something, but also watching them is, for me, there are 4 things that drive our learning. It's if you need to know something, if you find something useful for your life, if you find something interesting, or it's relevant. And it's generally those 4 things that drive my children's learning. So when you say how will they learn the things they need to know for life, if they need to know it for life, it will come up in life and we learn it when it happens. My younger son has naturally learned to read without any particular formal teaching or curriculum or plan to read. And because of the way that he has learned large and complex words first, and yet his because that's what he's needed to know to understand the text that he's looking at. He's not needed to know yet what the individual letters sound like. So that is something that he's starting to do as he becomes more and more interested in building, as he becomes more familiar with words and he's starting to recognize the sounds and pairing them. Now he's learning the sounds associated with the individual letters, because that's what's needed and interested for him now. Whereas that's not been needed and relevant and interesting for him up to this point, because he's been reading contextually. So we assume that it's all going to go in a very linear, simple and building up fashion. And I think when you have natural learning, that's not the case. Something might become needed or useful or relevant or interesting in a different order and in a different way, depending on what's happening in your life. And if you genuinely need it for life, when you look at learning as a lifelong thing, it doesn't matter whether you learn it at 8 or you learn it at 14 or 25 or 95. If it didn't become needed or useful, obviously didn't need it. Whereas the other question is, how will they learn all the things they need to know to pass an exam? That's a different question. Because often on exam curriculum, there is a set of things you need to know that might never be needed other than to pass the exam. It might not be useful or interesting or relevant to you, only to meet those criteria to pass an exam, which is why our plan has always going to be, we will take, if we need a formal qualification following our passions, we will look at doing it then, as opposed to at 16, let's learn all this content and take all the exams because we might need it in the future. That, which is very much the school way of looking at getting what you need to know for life or for your exams. We're doing the opposite way around. We're saying we'll continue to follow our passions. If at some point, and my eldest one is already talking about what he's going to do to be more independent in terms of financially independent, and thinking about, he's already saying, I want to start to set my alarm in the morning because I want to learn to get up, because when I get a job, so this is not this assumption that I can't be bothered to get a job. It's like, when I get a job, so he's already making that, and that's not driven by me, that's internally, intrinsically driven by him. And so if he gets to the point where he is saying, I'm really interested in this and I think I can make money or have a job in this, if then he needs a qualification in it, then we have a need for a qualification, and then we will go and learn a curriculum content, because it then meets the criteria of being needed and being relevant and being interesting at that point, which is very different to how it's done outside of unschooling.
Very different. It's like topsy-turvy.
It is.
Actually, it's like it's completely the other way. Yeah. The other way around. And one of the things you've mentioned that we've not mentioned yet, so I'm gonna draw that out now, is the internal motivation, that what our children are doing and what they're choosing to do comes from like an internal innate drive, actually from within them, that motivates them on to ask questions, to persevere with whatever new thing that they're doing, to do the research and watch the YouTubers. All that stuff is driven by an internal motivation, whereas when we're talking about turning everything up and topsy-turvy, school isn't. It's all external. It's a system that has to be where they have to use external, and I don't use have to very often, but they have to use external motivation, because actually, why else? Why, when you start to question it, why do I want to sit here and learn this right now? I don't really. I would actually, as children or young people, they'd rather be doing probably a very large number of other things than sitting in a school classroom. So they have to use external motivation
to get through that content that is chosen by somebody else.
Yeah, and I mean, in primary schools, that very much looks like reward charts and stickers and certificates and or
removal of privileges, removal of break times, removal of or the threats of you'll be sent to the teacher, or you won't be able to go and have your golden time, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Whereas that doesn't occur at all for us, because they're constantly following their passions and their interests, and that intrinsic motivation is high. It's what's the key.
And I'm not trying to entice them to learn something by using external motivation, by using a sparkly motivator, reward system or otherwise, which includes for me certain narratives around, if you don't do this, you won't get a job. That's an external motivator as well. If you don't do this, you will fail in life. If you don't do this, you won't get your exams. Those are external motivators, even though they are negative motivators, they're motivations of fear, really. And those things just aren't part of our toolkit of
But that doesn't mean to say that we can't have a conversation, but it's framed differently. So, for example, I might say to one of my children, these are skills that you might find useful later as we go through life. That doesn't mean to say we have to learn them now and I'm going to force you, but it starts to sow those seeds, because I think, and particularly with some of the challenges that my children have got, is that it's a long game. So I think, like the example of my older son setting the alarm, that the idea came from we had an external speaker come and talk to us, Dr. Andy Cope, and he talked about the idea of instilling good habits, which was something that really obviously resonated with my older one. And 2 years on, which is almost exactly 2 years on, I think, my older one is saying, well, I want to get into the habit of setting an alarm and getting up early so that I'm used to that for when I get a job. And so that's a 2 year. It's not something that we've necessarily we've talked about it, but we're not making a big thing of it, and I don't set an alarm unless we have to get up for a particular reason. But it's something that obviously he's taken on board, and he's decided intrinsically within himself that it's a skill that he wants to be familiar with, or practice for a point where he thinks it will be more required of him. And I think we see that coming, say, from an internal drive, as opposed to, somebody say, well, if you don't make them get up, how will they ever learn to get up for a job? And I'm like, I don't need to have that conversation. We can have a conversation that says these skills might be helpful as you get older, but there's no fear in it, there's no coercion in it, there's no punishment in it. They are ideas that we're putting out without any baggage around it.
And what's really interesting is, or what I find really interesting is, you use that example of your eldest wanting to, rehearse that skill and know how that feels and get into the habit, and he's taken that idea for himself, and he's putting a plan in about how he wants that to work out. But what happens in unschooling is that that's not going to be the same for everybody. That's not a blueprint for how every other 13-year-old or 14-year-old or 15-year-old may explore that for themselves. That's how he has taken that on board and decided to do that. One of the things I find really interesting is my 13-year-old has an interesting relationship with sleep and always has done. And people will say, how will he get up, when he has to go to a job, for example, or how does he get up in the morning when there's something that you need to do that day that requires him to get up? So last week we went out for the day as a family, and we had to leave the house by 9:30 in the morning. We were catching a train. That was our ideal. I mean, if we'd been a bit later, it wouldn't have mattered, but it was early, not in his time, normal awake time at all. But because he wanted to go, because he wanted to come with us, he was able to get up and do that. So that's back to that self-motivation thing, that internal motivation. And that's the same when they, that can be applied for when they get a job. When they find something they want to do, they will adjust their lives, their sleep cycles, their, whatever they need to have in place to be able to do that. And like you say, it's that long game as well. Like learning is a long game. It doesn't end at 18 when they take their A levels, or maybe if you go to university, it doesn't end then. That's not, we don't have this end goal, this finish line of education. It's a long game. We can learn things forevermore, ongoing into the rest of our lives.
And I think that was something that it really hit home. But when I started really looking at unschooling and how I wanted my children's experience of learning to be different to what I had, I remember when I left, so I'd gone through GCSEs, A levels, did a 4-year first degree, then I did a master's. I remember got to the end of my master's and I'm like, I never want to learn anything ever again. And as far as I was concerned, that was my learning done. Now, obviously, all the unconscious learning as we go through life was something that I was not clocking, but it was only, during, so that was 20 years on, it was only through looking at my children's learning journey and looking at how different it can be when you are learning things from a place of intrinsic motivation and interest and relevancy and usefulness in your own life, that my own love of learning has returned and is blossoming. And there's never enough time to learn all things you want to learn. And I'm very, very much now embraced that I'm constantly learning, and there's always new things. And I'm now that I understand better how I learn now because of the journey that I've been through with my children, and that I'm turning over years of assumptions and thoughts about learning that I'm having to reject from my own experience of school, and embracing that anew from my own learning now. I'm loving it. It's amazing, to not have that fear and that judgment all the time. I think that's another massive difference for our children, is that like, for example, if your children are doing something, they do it for themselves. They're not, my eldest has suddenly discovered this AI story writing. He doesn't write the stories for me to evaluate as a child would at school. They're only writing the story because the teacher's going to mark it and assess where they are and judge it. My son writes these stories because he loves writing these stories, and actually he doesn't really want to show me, because they are his stories for him. They are not written to be judged. And when you don't judge our children, and we don't judge what they're doing and grade it and mark it and assess it, I think they're much more likely to take risks and run with it than when they are in school and know that everything they do is doing for a reason of being judged, and not at all for the passion of doing it. And that is that's setting a completely different tone for life in general. When school children are only doing things for assessment, versus our children that are doing own things only because they love doing them. I'm always amazed at how core skills come out as a byproduct of following passions, as opposed to doing those things to generate and learn the core skills. It's completely flipped over.
Yeah, which is why I think one of the reasons why people can find it quite disconcerting is that complete flip over of everything, and trusting that process and trusting that learning that isn't set out before us. So you've mentioned how much unschooling has impacted your life personally. So I'm just going to quickly remind people, or let people know, that you and I have done a previous podcast on deschooling. And I won't explain what deschooling is, but if people, particularly those of you who have recently deregistered your children and are looking at unschooling, a podcast on deschooling first will be really helpful for you. But it links really nicely to what you were just saying about how we have to, unpick, relearn a lot of the things that we were taught at school about what learning is and what learning looks like, and how it is, and rediscover for ourselves a love of learning in our own lives.
Yeah, and particularly where you're not in a situation where you're going to be assessed. I think one of the other things I was pondering before we came on and talked about this is some of the assumptions that are different when you unschool as compared to a child that's in school. So we make a baseline assumption that children are born innately driven to learn and understand their environment. We know and we trust that children want to understand, and given a rich enough and supportive environment, they will learn and understand and make connections and understanding. Where when you're in a school system, there's almost an assumption that children can't learn anything unless they're explicitly taught by experts, and that they're completely incapable of learning unless they're taught. And I think these two fundamental assumptions that underpin the foundation of the two different paradigms cause a completely different outlook in the way that children learn and the way that they view themselves. I hope and believe my children feel they are competent learners. They can go out and learn and understand, and if they can't understand something themselves, they can go and find an expert if they need to, or find a book, or find a resource, but they're starting with a fundamental principle of understanding that they can go and understand the world, driven internally with an internal locus of control. Whereas when you're in a schooling paradigm, the assumption is the child is passive, that they are like an empty computer box, a computer that needs to be coded with data and programs in order to function as a human being. And that is simply not borne out from my experience and from my own personal experience, but also from watching my children learn and how they understand the world and navigate the world around them. It absolutely, my children are very active and exploratory, and listening, particularly for my younger one who has never been to school, and seeing his comfort and ease with numbers and numeracy, for example, and how naturally he's picked up reading without a sort of any kind of formal teaching at all, proves to me that children are, in a supportive environment that's rich, will seek to understand the world in which they're engaged in.
Yeah, I think one of the things that does us a disservice actually is comparing our children with children in school. So because of the way that things are so entirely different, and because we are allowing their natural learning to unfold, comparing that to how children in school are being prescribed learning. So what our children are learning and choosing to learn is not comparable with what children are being taught in schools. So when we do that side by side, what are children learning in maths in year 2? What's my child learning in maths at the same age? It's really unhelpful because it's not the same process at all. No. And so we do ourselves a disservice by focusing on that instead of focusing on what is my child doing, how are they learning, what skills are they acquiring, what interests do they have, in which we can then celebrate the things that are happening, instead of looking at and comparing it to school and wondering and looking at what's missing, via that comparison.
I think the other interesting thing that's really struck me in the last couple of years is the difference between real learning and understanding versus sort of short-term memory recall. So and I think particularly emotionally looking at sort of tests and worksheets and that kind of thing, and what I noticed is my children get a very deep understanding. It's not just, I think I've read a book somewhere, it was likened to you can memorize the places on a map, and that is kind of like, and you can recite them and you can give that as a test, but real deep understanding is knowing how to navigate between the places on the map. And I very much see that with my children, is that their learning is web-like and is deep and is a really, it's about adding to their mental models of the whole of the world and their understanding, rather than simply being able to recall a set of information that they might need for a test. They're very, very different skills and very different paradigms, and arguably I would say it takes longer and is a sort of less obvious learning process when you're learning in this very deep, connected way. Whereas if you're trying to generate a kind of go through a curriculum and a list of activities, and you do a worksheet and say, oh yes, well they know that, it doesn't necessarily mean they've learned it in the same deep sense that when you're allowed to explore it and generate those connections. There are two different types of learning, from as far as I see it, in terms of I see my children, and from my own experience of being in school. And so it can look like our children are not getting through as much content, but I feel that the learning is very different and the education and the understanding is very different, in when they can explore it and make those connections for themselves.
I would like to know where we can read your blog, which you mentioned earlier. So can you tell us a little bit about where we can find you on social media, if people want to come and listen to more about your educational journey in your family, your home educating journey?
So predominantly, what my blogs and my general musings on life in general are posted on my website, which is connectandrespect.co.uk. I have lots of blogs and recordings, and I think our blog, our deschooling blog, is is also on there. And I have a Facebook page called Connect and Respect, which I share things as well. I go through periods of being quite prolific and periods of being quite quiet, depending, because I'm very much motivated by writing when I feel called to write, as opposed to just writing once a week or whatever. So that's where you can find me. So that's my website, connectandrespect.co.uk, or my Facebook page, Connect and Respect.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for coming and joining me here again. And it's been amazing to talk about natural learning with you and how that looks in our lives. And I know people really appreciate us sharing those things as a way of, just showcasing is the wrong word really, but maybe spotlighting, what that can look like, as a way of encouraging those families who are not operating in mainstream education anymore. And listeners can join me again next month, when I will be talking to another lovely guest on a topic from an unschooling